avoidant. Now, if you're the empath, you don't just feel your own feelings, you feel everyone's. You walk into a room and can pick up tension like it's background music. And if you've ever fallen for an avoidant partner, chances are you can't stop thinking about them, even when they've emotionally ghosted you a dozen times. But here's the twist. What no one tells you is this: they can't stop thinking about you either. You, the super empath, are living rent-free in their head. Why? Because you represent emotional depth, you represent presence, you represent what they're terrified of, but secretly crave. Now, here's what the avoidant doesn't show you. They replay your words. They feel guilt. They go cold, not because they don't care, but because caring feels overwhelming. And you sense that. You feel the push-pull and still stay emotionally available, sometimes to your own detriment. But here's where your power lies. Being emotionally intuitive doesn't mean you have to be emotionally available for everyone. Being loving doesn't mean you have to be the fixer. You can be empathetic and empowered. If you've been living in someone's mind rent-free, it's time to start charging rent. And by rent, I mean emotional reciprocity. You don't need to become harder. You just need to become clearer. Clear on what you deserve, clear on your boundaries, clear on when love feels like confusion, and when it feels like safety. Your empathy is a superpower. But remember, superpowers need direction. The relationship between an empath and an avoidant is like an emotional dance choreographed by invisible instincts. When an empath meets someone who operates from an avoidant attachment style, something almost magnetic happens. Not because the avoidant gives them reassurance or safety, in fact, quite the opposite, but because the empath can feel the complexity underneath the avoidant's distance. Where most people might see coldness or indifference, the empath senses an internal storm. There's an unspoken narrative they pick up on, an emotional hum they can't hear the tension, the fear, the unspoken longing. It's subtle, but it's real. Avoidants aren't emotionless. They're self-protective. They've usually learned that closeness equals vulnerability and vulnerability equals pain or disappointment or even rejection. So instead of leaning in, they pull away. But empaths are uniquely tuned to the emotional frequencies others try to mute. So when an avoidant creates space or distance, the empath doesn't just walk away. They lean in emotionally, psychologically, energetically. They want to understand. They want to bridge the gap. They want to be the exception. That's where the connection deepens, almost silently. The empath isn't chasing the avoidant for validation. They're drawn in by something they recognize, an emotional truth that's been buried. It's as if they can see the avoidant's inner child, frightened, guarded, craving connection, but unsure how to ask for it. The avoidant might never say it aloud, but the empath feels it in their silence. And that's what keeps the empath hooked. Empaths tend to internalize the emotions of others as if they were their own. So when the avoidant pulls away, it doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like pain they must heal, confusion they must clarify, a signal they must decode. This pattern can become addictive, because when the avoidant offers even a small breadcrumb of warmth or vulnerability, it feels monumental to the empath. It validates everything they thought they felt. It says, yes, you're not imagining it. There is something deeper here. And so they stay. But it's more than just emotional detection. Empaths often carry an unconscious belief that their ability to feel deeply is meant to serve others. So when they sense someone in emotional hiding, it activates their instinct to reach out, to fix, to prove that emotional safety exists. This is where the bond forms, not because both people are showing up equally, but because the empath is emotionally laboring for two. They're holding space for the connection and the other person's fear. What makes this dynamic even more potent is that the avoidant also senses the empath's depth. They might not articulate it, but it touches something inside them. It's why they don't fully let go. Even if they withdraw, they keep the empath close in subtle ways, sporadic messages, vague check-ins, unfinished conversations. Because the empath represents something rare, unconditional emotional presence, something the avoidant both wants and resists. This silent exchange is what makes the connection feel so significant to the empath. They're not imagining the depth, it's there. But they're often the only one navigating it out loud. The avoidant may never express their side in a clear or consistent way, which leaves the empath in a cycle of emotional guessing. And because they're so attuned to feelings, they often fill in the blanks with compassion rather than boundaries. So while the outside world may not understand why the empath feels so tethered to someone who won't open up, the empath knows what they feel is real. They've read between the lines. They've picked up the emotional subtext, and they've connected with the truth that even the avoidant struggles to admit. That underneath the distance is someone who longs to be seen, but is afraid of what happens once they are. Avoidants are often misunderstood as cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable by choice. From the outside, it can appear as if they simply don't care. They don't chase. They don't explain. They seem to slip away into emotional silence without warning. But what most people don't realize is that avoidants are not emotionally indifferent. They're emotionally overwhelmed. Their way of dealing with intense feelings is to disconnect, shut down, and create space. But within that space, the person they've distanced themselves from, especially if that person is a deeply feeling empath, continues to occupy their thoughts in ways they rarely admit or even fully understand themselves. The empath, having offered emotional safety and depth, leaves a lasting impression. Unlike fleeting flings or shallow connections, the bond with a super empath cuts through the avoidance defenses in a way few others can. It lingers, it stirs discomfort, it raises internal conflict. The avoidant feels seen, maybe for the first time in a long time, and while that can be magnetic, it's also terrifying. So instead of leaning in, they pull back, but the pulling back doesn't erase the impact. In fact, the distance often makes it more obvious just how much the empath still lives in their mind. Avoidants can be haunted by the memory of connection. They replay conversations. They overthink texts they didn't answer. They wonder what the empath is thinking now that they've gone quiet. They may not act on those thoughts, but they feel them. They might open the empath's messages and not reply, not out of malice, but because engaging means opening a door they don't feel ready to walk through. So they watch from behind the emotional glass. They observe, they remember, they even miss. But reaching out feels vulnerable. It feels like surrender. And vulnerability is the very thing their attachment system warns them to avoid. That internal conflict creates a kind of paralysis. The avoidant mind becomes a loop of regret, fear, longing, and resistance. They wonder if they pushed too far, if they waited too long, if they could go back without losing control. And at the center of that loop is the empath, still very much alive in their thoughts. Not because the empath is chasing or messaging or showing up, but because the experience of emotional depth is hard to forget. It breaks through the walls they thought were impenetrable. It leaves a mark. Avoidants often return in subtle or inconsistent ways. A sudden, "Hey, how have you been?" A like on a story. A random memory they mention months after going silent. These aren't just tactics, they're signs. They're testing the waters. They want to know if the door is still open, if the empath still cares, if that emotional connection can be revisited without the pressure they associate with intimacy. But behind that casual re-entry is a mind that's been circling around the connection the entire time. The tragedy in this dynamic is that the empath often assumes the avoidant forgot them, that their silence meant indifference. But what the empath doesn't see is the emotional storm happening behind the scenes. The avoidance is often a cover for a deep emotional response they can't regulate. It's not that they didn't care. It's that caring activated everything they were trying to outrun. The empath may be the one visibly feeling, but the avoidant is often the one quietly spiraling, not in a dramatic or external way, but internally where their thoughts can't seem to let go. The warmth, the presence, the understanding they felt with the empath becomes something they measure others against. It becomes a standard they remember even when they try to deny it. The connection didn't vanish. It settled into the background of their mind, where it plays like a familiar song they can't turn off. And though they may never fully say it, the empath lives there 24/7. Empathy is a beautiful and rare gift. It allows someone to feel deeply, to connect authentically, and to understand others in ways that most people can't. But when empathy is given without boundaries, it turns from a gift into a heavy emotional burden. Super empaths, especially those in relationships with avoidant individuals, often find themselves carrying not only their own emotional weight, but also the suppressed emotions of the person who refuses to face them. And over time, this creates a slow emotional drain that can leave the empath exhausted, confused, and even resentful without fully understanding why. When you're an empath, you're naturally attuned to the needs of others. You notice the micro shifts in tone, the tension behind a quiet sigh, the unspoken fears someone else would easily miss. In a relationship with an avoidant, this sensitivity becomes a double-edged sword. Because the avoidant doesn't verbalize their needs or emotions, the empath becomes hyper-vigilant, trying to interpret, anticipate, and soothe things that were never said aloud. They become emotional detectives, constantly decoding mixed signals, body language, and silences, trying to keep the connection alive. The problem is that this kind of emotional labor is invisible and it's constant. The empath begins to internalize the emotional health of the relationship as their responsibility. If the avoidant withdraws, they ask themselves what they did wrong. If the avoidant gets close and then shuts down, they rationalize it, trying to be understanding, patient, and forgiving, even when they feel hurt. This pattern repeats again and again. The empath gives more, hoping that eventually the avoidant will feel safe enough to stay emotionally present. But what often happens is that the empath ends up feeling more alone in the relationship than they would feel by themselves. Without boundaries, empathy becomes self-sacrifice. The empath absorbs the avoidant's discomfort, often excusing emotional unavailability as trauma, past pain, or just the way they are. And while understanding someone's emotional wounds is compassionate, making yourself small or constantly available to accommodate those wounds is not love, it's emotional martyrdom. You start abandoning your own needs, suppressing your own feelings, and justifying behavior that doesn't meet your standards for closeness just to keep the connection going. Over time, this depletes the empath. They may not even realize it at first. They'll tell themselves they're strong enough to handle it, that their partner just needs time, that their patience will be rewarded with love. But emotional exhaustion creeps in silently. It shows up as anxiety, second-guessing, feeling unappreciated, or sensing that their own needs no longer matter. The empath is still offering love, but now it comes from a place of survival instead of joy. Boundaries aren't walls, they're clarity. They don't say, "I don't care about you." They say, "I care about me too." When an empath puts boundaries in place, they reclaim the space to breathe, to think, to rest, and to choose their emotional investments more wisely. They begin to see that love shouldn't feel like chasing, that understanding someone doesn't mean tolerating emotional neglect, and that holding space for someone else shouldn't mean abandoning yourself in the process. The empath who learns to set boundaries becomes more powerful, not less loving, because now their empathy is guided, protected, and intentional. They're no longer bleeding for people who won't even bring a bandage. They're no longer giving energy where there's no mutual respect. And they're no longer mistaking their emotional strength for a license to endure imbalance. Real love involves mutual care, and empathy, when rooted in self-respect, becomes not just a gift to others, but also a gift to yourself. Empaths often equate love with understanding. They believe that if they can just hold space for someone long enough, show enough patience, give enough love, eventually that person will feel safe enough to step fully into the relationship. This mindset often stems from the deep emotional intelligence and sensitivity empaths possess. They don't run at the first sign of discomfort, they lean in. They believe that behind every wall is a wound, and they feel called to offer healing. But this devotion can come at a cost when it's not met with emotional reciprocity. Emotional depth, while beautiful, needs to be balanced with self-respect. Otherwise, empathy becomes overextension and compassion becomes self-abandonment. True empowerment for an empath doesn't mean shutting off their feelings or becoming emotionally distant. It means recognizing that their depth is a strength, not a tool to earn love. Many empaths fall into the trap of believing that if they just love someone hard enough, that love will be returned in the same way. But relationships don't work like emotional vending machines. You don't insert care, patience, and presence and automatically get commitment, consistency, and security. People only give what they are emotionally capable of giving, and sometimes what they're capable of doesn't match what you need. Avoidance, in particular, can trigger a deep wound in empaths. The desire to be chosen without having to fight for it. Empaths will sense the avoidance discomfort with closeness and will often adjust themselves to accommodate it. They pull back when the avoidant pulls away, they give space when things get intense, they forgive the inconsistencies, all while silently hoping that their quiet loyalty will be seen and appreciated. But this dynamic subtly teaches the empath to settle for less, to accept emotional scraps, and to override their own needs in the name of being understanding. This is where the shift begins. Empowerment is not about becoming less empathetic, it's about directing that empathy inward. It's about asking, Am I being understood as much as I strive to understand? It's about noticing when your needs are being consistently unmet and choosing to speak up instead of staying silent. It's realizing that love doesn't have to feel like emotional labor, that you don't have to carry the emotional weight of both people in the relationship. And most importantly, it's remembering that you deserve to feel safe, heard, and valued, not just when someone else is ready, but all the time. Emotional depth should not require emotional sacrifice. You can be deeply connected to someone and still say, "This doesn't work for me." You can feel empathy for someone's wounds and still walk away when those wounds create harm. Setting boundaries and walking away are not betrayals of your empathy. They are acts of self-respect. They are proof that you've grown from needing to be needed to needing to be nourished. The most powerful version of an empath is the one who knows their worth. The one who no longer romanticizes pain as proof of love. The one who can sit in someone's darkness without letting it consume their light. When an empath becomes empowered, they stop chasing clarity in places where only confusion lives. They stop mistaking emotional resistance for mystery, and they begin to prioritize alignment over potential. Empowerment for the empath means choosing connections that feel mutual. It means not waiting to be chosen, but choosing themselves first. It means honoring their heart not just for how much it can feel, but for how much it deserves in return. Emotional depth is a gift, but only when it's held with self-respect. And when the empath finally stands in that power, they stop trying to prove they are enough and start choosing people who already know that they are. Empaths are naturally wired to care. They're the first to ask if you're okay, the first to stay up late talking you through your feelings, and the first to offer forgiveness even when it's not asked for. Their emotional bandwidth is vast. They have the ability to hold space for others in a way that feels rare and deeply comforting. But for empaths, the line between compassion and emotional self-neglect can blur quickly, especially in relationships with avoidant partners who tend to offer inconsistency, distance, and ambiguity instead of clarity, reassurance, and reciprocity. When you care deeply, you may feel that turning away from someone in pain is cruel. So instead of creating distance or setting boundaries, you stay, you try harder. You show even more love, more understanding, more softness. And when the avoidant pulls away, you don't get angry. You try to be the calm. You believe your consistency will eventually dissolve their fear. But this pattern often leads to emotional imbalance, where the empath is constantly giving and adjusting, while the avoidant takes up space without matching the effort or depth. The empath begins to confuse compassion with endurance. True compassion, however, isn't about staying in situations that drain you. It's not about tolerating mistreatment under the banner of understanding someone's trauma. Compassion can coexist with clarity. You can care deeply about someone's pain and still acknowledge that it's not your job to carry it. You can be kind and still walk away. You can offer empathy without allowing it to become a tether that keeps you stuck in an unfulfilling dynamic. Being consumed by someone else's emotional world doesn't make your love stronger, it makes your boundaries weaker. And love that costs you your peace isn't love that's being returned in a healthy way. If you find yourself constantly explaining away someone's distant behavior, waiting for them to open up, or shrinking your emotional needs so you don't scare them off, that's not compassion, it's emotional self-abandonment. Compassion means offering understanding without sacrificing your standards for what it means to feel seen and valued. When empaths realize that compassion doesn't require emotional self-sacrifice, something powerful happens. They begin to differentiate between feeling for someone and being responsible for their healing. They stop showing up to fix people and start asking, does this person meet me with the same energy? They stop mistaking chaos for chemistry. They stop finding meaning in mixed signals and start finding peace in mutual effort. Avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional intimacy, and it's true that many of them carry deep wounds. But their inability to connect consistently is not the empath's responsibility to resolve. Everyone has a right to their healing process, but no one has the right to use their healing as a reason to hurt others. Compassion says, I see your pain. But empowerment adds, and I won't ignore mine in the process. The healthiest kind of empathy is rooted in self-awareness. It knows when to give and when to pull back. It knows when to listen and when to ask, what about me? And it doesn't mistake emotional availability for emotional obligation. You are not required to stay in relationships where you're always soothing, always waiting, always trying to be enough. You can be loving and still choose yourself. Ultimately, emotional clarity comes from knowing the difference between compassion and compromise. Compassion says, I understand you. Clarity says, but I also understand myself. Together, they protect your peace. When you pair your deep feeling with firm self-respect, you stop being consumed by others and start becoming whole within yourself. You stop chasing love that drains you and start attracting love that meets you. Because real love doesn't require you to lose yourself to prove you care. It meets you where you already are, whole, present, and enough. So, to every super empath listening, know this: your emotional depth is not a weakness. It's not something to shrink, soften, or hide just to make others more comfortable. It's a rare gift. But that gift wasn't meant to be handed to people who run from it. You were not born to chase, to decode, or to emotionally babysit people who fear their own hearts. You don't need to overextend yourself just to feel worthy of love. You don't have to stay in spaces where your warmth is met with cold silence. The fact that you care deeply doesn't mean you owe anyone unlimited access to your energy. Let go of the idea that healing someone is how you'll be loved. You don't need to be the exception to someone's pattern to be special. You're already special because of how you love, how you show up, and how you feel. The right person won't be intimidated by that. They'll be inspired by it. Yes, the avoidant may think of you constantly. Yes, you may live in their mind, but you deserve more than to be a beautiful memory in someone's silence. You deserve to be a priority in someone's presence. So hold your empathy close, keep your heart open, but make sure your love always includes you. Thank you for giving me your time, your energy, and your heart today. If this message spoke to you, if it reflected something you've lived or something you're still learning to walk away from, know that you're not alone. You're part of a rare kind of strength that feels deeply and still dares to heal. Take care of your gift, protect your peace, and always remember you can be soft and strong, loving and clear, open and empowered. Thank you, and take good care of your heart. Goodbye for now.